Okay, folks, we're back with part two, and so let's get going. Okay, so in part one, we talked about, excuse me, the continuation of of the High Middle Ages, right? And our guiding question was focused on the struggle between, remember, the Pope and the kings, right? The power of the church versus the power of the state, the kingdoms, but also the power the struggle between the king and his people. Okay, so we're going to get to that second part today. But just a brief recap. So we talked about, this idea of the two swords theory, right? That is an ancient theory that gets brought back up in the Middle Ages by the popes. And the idea, remember, is that God, Jesus, the Holy Father, grants the Pope two swords, right? Metaphorical swords, and one sword is is the spiritual role, right? Showing the leadership position of the Catholic Church, of the Pope himself, that he is the anointed leader, the ruler over all people on earth, even the ones that he hasn't seen. But that he is in charge of their souls, he is in charge of their everlasting salvation and getting them to heaven. The second sword is the temporal sword, or the sword of government, right? And the temporal sword is granted to kings and emperors by the Pope as a way of signifying their power and prestige, and to show that they have, authority over their people. But remember, two things. Number one, the spiritual sword is of greater value. It is more important according to the two swords theory. Okay, and the temporal sword. So it is overrules the temporal sword. And the second thing, remember, is that the temporal sword is kind of like on loan. It can be taken away by the popes from the kings, from the emperors. And that is done through excommunication. So if you don't do as the Pope commands, you can be kicked out of the church, and also you can be kicked out of heaven by that same act. So remember, this is a continuing battle between the popes and the power of the church, smashing its head, and the kings smashing their head back, in this continuous fight throughout the Middle Ages. Who overrules who? Okay. And this leads to, like we said, big problems between, we already saw one big problem with the investiture controversy, but now we have, this other big problem. It's almost like there's a set of two laws throughout all of these kingdoms, in France and England, parts of Spain, Germany. Everywhere you go in Western Europe, there's this battle. There's two laws. There's the spiritual laws, and then there's the secular laws, the laws from the government. And which one do you follow? And if you follow one, can you legitimately follow the other one? And we understand that for people in a modern society, they might focus on religious aspects and rules that they have to follow according to whatever religion they practice. But in the medieval times, this was very difficult, because people were so ingrained to the religious aspects of their lives, right? This was a legitimate thing for people. They truly cared about the salvation of their souls, where they were going. Were they going to heaven? Were they going to hell? And remember, there was no choice. You had to believe or you were punished. And there's no choice between churches. There was only one church. So it was much more difficult for people back then. Do they follow the king or do they follow the Pope? Can they follow both at the same time without confrontation? And that we know the answer to that is they can, but it limits a society, right? You can't have two simultaneous law code systems going on together and expect people to be able to follow them, because what do you do when they conflict with one another? Okay. So we talked about that, and now we're going to move on. So we talked about Henry II and his amazing wife, right? Remember, so there was Henry II, King of England, and he controlled a ton of France. And then we have his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and when she gets married to him and becomes the queen, it sets up the next series of battles that's going to be occurring between England and France for the next 100 or so years plus. Okay, and but she was a pretty amazing woman, as we've talked about, and you know, she gave birth to a bunch of amazing people for various reasons, or excuse me, for they're amazing people for various reasons. And so that's what we're going to pick up with today. Okay. So let's get to. Oh yeah, this is pretty amazing. It's it's a like a vase, a chalice that is carved. Well, it's gold, obviously, and jeweled, and it's also carved out of rock crystal. And this was given to Eleanor by her father, and then this was given as a wedding gift from Eleanor to her first husband, Louis VII, at their wedding day. And it's in the Louvre, and it still survives today, 1,000 years old. It's an amazing piece of craftsmanship. So there's that. And then we talked about, remember, this investor controversy, right? Poor old Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, former friend of Henry II. And, you know, they had this all planned out that they were going to take care of, you know, get around the Pope's wishes, get around the power of the church. But then Thomas Becket, well, I don't know, has a change of heart and starts to really believe in this whole, you know, church thing. And, you know, that leads to confrontation with his former friend, Henry. And, well, he ends up getting murdered. And Henry is forced to do penance for that. Okay? But, so now we're going to talk about, well, continuation of this High Middle Ages thing. Okay? All right. Okay, here we go. By the time we get to the 13th century, so right when we start switching from the 1100s into the 1200s, we see that the power of the Roman Catholic Church that's been on this continual you know, ascent since the time of the Romans. You know, when they were when Christians were being slaughtered en masse by the Romans and everything else. We see, you know, little triumphs, right, with like Constantine, and then eventually Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that goes away. But it just keeps going, you know, century after century after century, until we get to around the year 1200. And at this point, the church is, many people would argue, many scholars would argue that this century, the 1200s to the 12 to 1300, is, well, really the high point of the Roman Catholic Church, of Christianity in general. There is no other game in town. It's all going through the Roman Catholic Church. That this is the high point of the church. This is their zenith. At no point will they possess more power than they do at this you know, in this 100 or so years, give or take, you know, decades. It doesn't mean that once they hit the year 300, all of a sudden they start becoming weak and sliding into, you know, non-existence or anything like that. Not at all. The Catholic Church still, you know, commands a huge amount of power in the present day, in you know, 700 years later. But by the time you get to the year 1200, the Roman Catholic Church is a mover and shaker in European politics, not just when it comes to religious considerations, but in European politics in total, okay? The Vatican and the popes are not so much just the spiritual leaders of Europe. They're now all of a sudden, they've transformed into being the spiritual leaders, but also taking on a more active political role on who decides, you know, they decide who gets to be king, who gets to be queen, and so on. Who gets to be emperor, who gets crowned, and who's in charge in a kingdom or an empire. And this, remember, causes major, you know, headbutting between the various rulers. But the Vatican expands to a very, very large degree. And I think, yeah, here we go. So by the time you get to, you know, the early 1200s, you see the expansion, and we wrote this down the other day, but I'll write it down again. The expansion of what's called the Papal States. Okay. So the Papal States, obviously centered in Rome, okay, the capital, and then inside of Rome you have the Vatican, right? The Vatican City, okay, where so there's Rome, and then inside of Rome you have this area that's separated off from the rest of Rome. It's its own independent city within this city, okay? Um, the popes go back and forth between the Vatican and across the Tiber River to what's called the Lateran Palace. And it's at this time that you see the expansion of the Papal States, and you see the expansion of the Roman Catholic Church to its highest extent. The Papal States, in essence, become a papal monarchy. Okay, so we understand that monarchy is the rule of a king, right, or a queen as the head of state. The Pope, in essence, by the year 1200, becomes the same thing. Not only are they, the spiritual leader of Europe, but they become. It's almost like they become Pope/king in their own right of this area called the Papal States. Okay, the Papal States expand. They have everything in them that a normal kingdom would have. The Pope is never considered, is not called, your Majesty or anything like that. But he is given other titles like Your Excellency or Your Holiness, which they still use today. But the Papal States expand to the point where they have their own army. The Pope has his own army, which is interesting. And we're not talking about like a crusading army, but an actual army, usually comprised of mercenaries. Soldiers come from around Europe. The Pope is willing to pay handsomely for their expertise, and they follow him. As long as he's willing to pay, they're willing to fight his enemies. So you actually start seeing the popes using those using those armies as a way to expand the Papal States and as a way of, bargaining. So like if a pope gets in a confrontation with a king, the king can't just say, well, I'll just go take over, Rome and boot you out. Because now the Pope can say, well, you can try, but I have my own army, okay? This is totally unheard of, if you went back 700 years earlier to at the time when the Roman Catholic Church was just starting to get up, like in the Dark Ages, okay? Starting to come to its, it's this domination type area. And so you see that the papacy becomes this political entity as well too, okay? So we see the expansion of that as well. In 1198, where did my thing go? In 1198, okay, there it is. In 1198, the College of Cardinals elect a new pope. The old pope, I can't remember his name, Celestine or whatever, he dies, and the College of Cardinals elect a new pope. This new pope is an Italian. He comes from a noble family. His family will actually produce 9 different popes in their history. But this gentleman, he's a young man. He is elected Pope in 1198. He's only 37. He's not some, ancient 82-year-old guy with a big long beard. He's only 37. He has studied in both Pisa, right, in northern Italy, and he studied at the University of Paris. He's studied theology. His focus is on theology, but he also has studied law. So he's kind of a double threat. He's a priest, but he's also, for many intents and purposes, a lawyer. So a papal legate or a papal lawyer. He knows, because remember, there's 2 different law systems. There's 2 different law codes. There's the laws of the kings and there's laws of the church. And he's an expert at both of them, especially with the laws of the church. And so he's elected in 1198 at the age of 37. He's a very dynamic leader. Like I said, he's very skilled. He's a writer. He writes a lot of different treatises about, interpretation of like the Bible. But then his specialty, he focuses on law. Who's in charge? Am I in charge or is the king in charge? And obviously when he's writing up these, different theories, his focus is on the supremacy of the papal authorities. But underneath him, we see that these papal states, right? They expand really to their furthest degree, to the furthest extent. And in Rome, in the Vatican, we see a rise of that's we've seen before, a bureaucracy. Okay, so the Pope, Pope Innocent III, he knows that without power, that his own power is meaningless, and so he expands this bureaucracy in Rome itself, and he uses that to spread the influence of the Catholic Church throughout Europe, and he ingratiates himself in the lives and the political lives of numerous kings and queens and emperors and everything else throughout. Okay, so he was, once again, he was like a pope and a king at the same time. He was commander of his armed forces there, of his mercenary force. He expanded the treasury, because remember, this is where that whole investiture thing came from, and the church was raking in the money. They were just bringing in a ton of money, all from around Europe. Those dioceses and those parishes and everything else were just kicking up those tithes, right? Bringing that tithe money, the contributions from the people, all the way back into Rome. And so Innocent III, well, he realized that he had money. He realized that with money comes power and influence. So he did. He expanded a little bit more with the Vatican. He expanded some certain places in Rome. But most importantly, he wanted to expand his influence. Basically, he realized, I can't take over all of Europe. That would be silly. But he's not going to shy away from expanding his influence, and specifically his influence, not just the influence of the Catholic Church, but his influence over everyone. Okay, one of his most favorite pastimes was starting crusades. Okay, he realized that the crusading movement was a huge weapon when it came to expanding the power of the Roman Church, and so he signed off on numerous crusades. Now, crusades over in the Holy Land were expensive. And so his first crusades, let me get back to it. I'll show you the picture. Oops, where is it? Okay. So the first crusades that right when he gets elected Pope in 1198, he immediately starts off, and he wasn't the only Pope to do this, obviously, but he immediately starts off with declaring crusades. But these crusades are much closer to home. Why go all the way to the Holy Land to fight, which costed a lot of time and a lot of money, a lot of effort, when there's heretics that are much closer to home? So his focus is primarily in Spain, in northern Spain, and southern France. Okay, so in Spain, so in northern Spain and southern France, Innocent III expands the Crusades. And this is a way for him to keep pushing this idea that the Catholic Church is the one that calls the shots in Europe. What is in northern Spain, southern France? Well, like I said, you have Muslims, but they're not in northern Spain and in southern France. They're not in any way, shape, or form the majority. So that's not the problem. Not the Jewish populations, because once again, they're always the minority. The problem are heretical Christians. And we talked about that, the Catholic Church didn't just willy-nilly start murdering people, because, what's the point? But in northern Spain and southern France, it had reached a fervent pitch where there were so many Christians that had strayed from the path, that now we're talking about entire regions and cities that are focusing on their interpretation of the Bible, their interpretation of Jesus Christ, and refuting the teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, there's many different groups that did this, but the biggest ones were called, were these two groups of people. The first group, the biggest group, was called the Cathars, and then the second group were called the Waldensians. Okay, the Cathars and the Waldensians. Their major place of, their home base was southern France, a little bit in northern Spain, but mostly southern France. Once again, these people were Christian. However, they had refuted much of the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, and they believed in God in their way. Well, as we've seen, that was a huge no-no. So you couldn't just go and send like a person to teach them, not to do that. It was time for a crusade because there was way too many. But the Pope, Innocent, he offered a little tantalizing addition to this because it's like, oh gosh, the Pope is calling another crusade. It's going to cost so much money. He tossed in another little tidbit here, and he said, basically, if you go and you fight these heretical Christians, and you bring them to heel, and you bring them back into the fold, not only will you get all the typical, benefits of a crusade, like we talked about, like the plenary indulgence, right? All your sins will be wiped away, and you get to go to heaven and do all that. That's all great, but that's been promised before. The church has been promising that for 100 years. The thing that he offered, which piqued a lot of interest and got a lot of movement in this direction, was that if you went down there and you captured or you killed or whatever these people, and many of them were nobles, so it wasn't just like some peasant movement, these Cathars and Waldensians, but many of them were nobles. So basically, Innocent is saying, if you go down there and you defeat them, guess what? You get to keep their lands. You get to keep their castles and titles. You get to keep all the stuff that you take from them. So all of a sudden, he's tossed something new and juicy into the pot. Not only is he saying you're going to be forgiven of your sins, because, if you're doing bad things, this will help get you back in heaven. But hey, you can take all the stuff that you take from them. So a ton of people go, okay, awesome. Once again, most of the Crusaders come from France, from northern France. They flood down into southern France, and these crusades in Europe are extremely successful as compared to the ones in the Holy Land, in the Levant. These ones are extremely successful. These people down there, most of them are not, trained knights. They're just regular people. And so they are easily defeated by these crusading armies. And one after another, these cities in southern France and northern Spain fall to these crusading armies. They get destroyed. And this is a very, very brutal repression of these people. These people, like I said, are not brought back into the fold. They're killed. They're killed. These crusades, just like with Jerusalem in 1199, these people are, massacred to a large degree. One of the famous stories is in southern France. There's this little tiny town, and then there was a castle there, and it was called Bézerey. And reports are that there was only a small number of these Cathars that were actually in the castle, and then or in the town. And the majority of people that were just normal people were just kind of caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that's just where they lived. And so, one of the guys comes up to the commander, and the commander is this guy named Almeric, and he's an inquisitor. So he's a priest. He's a high priest. He has been sent out to destroy any type of heresy. And this is brought to him like, hey, what do we do? I mean, because it's not like these guys, have branded themselves with a C or something. It's not like they're holding up signs saying, hey, I'm a Cathar, and this guy's just a regular Catholic. What do we do? And famously, Almeric gives the order. He says, in a way, kill them all. God will know his own. And that's what they do. They just massacre all the inhabitants. And you would think, oh, geez, they send this off to Innocent III, and he'd be more than upset, like, what are you doing? You're killing innocent people. No, Innocent III is kind of like, well, you got to do what you got to do. You got to break some eggs, and that's how it goes. So we see once again that this is a very brutal pastime in a way. And even the innocent, well, that's usually the first people to go in a war. They are not safe from that, okay? But Innocent III is more focused not just on, destroying heretics in his backyard, but getting going with the idea of another crusade. And so that's what he does. In the year 1202, a little before that, yeah. Okay. So in the year 1202, okay, so if you're keeping track, we have the First Crusade, which is the only real militarily successful one. We have the Second Crusade, which fell apart a little bit later, almost as quickly as it started, never really made it to the Holy Land. The Third Crusade is run by two guys that we talked about, the son of Louis VII with his new wife, not with Eleanor, and then Eleanor's fourth son, Richard I. They are off in the Holy Land fighting in the Third Crusade. They don't make it as far as Jerusalem. They are stopped up by a Crusader state city called Acre, A-C-R-E, and they're fighting there. At this point, in the late 1100s, by 1198, all the Crusader states have been wiped out. There's only 3 cities that are still in the hands of the Crusaders. Jerusalem is not. Jerusalem has been retaken, and Richard I goes there. He doesn't make it as far as Jerusalem, but he does fight the Muslim commander, the Muslim leader Saladin, to a draw. Famously, they're fighting north of Acre, and Richard, because remember I told you, Richard hated to be king. He just wanted to fight. He was a crusader. He was always outside of the country, while his mother Eleanor was back home trying to fix things for him. He was fighting, and according to the story, his horse, he's heavily armored. His horse keeps getting killed from under him. He flies off the horse. Retainers bring him another horse, and he gets like 11 horses killed underneath him, and he goes back out there to keep fighting. At one point, there's no more horses, and he's fighting on foot. Well, Saladin, the Muslim commander and sultan, he's watching from his hillside from afar. And he knows, who Richard is because he's surrounded by his bodyguards and everything else. And he knows who Richard is. And he basically calls a stop to the fight, a halt to the fight. And he has a horse brought to Richard III, basically saying, or Richard I, basically saying, a king should never fight on foot. Here you go. Here's a nice horse for you. And Richard, is probably like, thanks, appreciate that. And gets back on his horse and they start the battle again. But there's no real victor. And so the Third Crusade remains not a victory or defeat for either side. It's kind of a draw, tactical draw. But a truce is called, there's not to be any fighting. Well, by the time you get to Innocent III, a couple years later, he's ready to start fighting again, and he calls another crusade. He does that in the year 1202. But at this point, the Crusaders, they've been fighting inside of Europe, and they've been fighting each other now for a long time, especially the English and French. They're sitting there slaughtering each other over who gets to rule France. And so there's no real impetus for a new crusade. Everybody's thinking to themselves, gosh, it takes so long, and it costs so much money to get everything together. But Innocent III will not be stopped. He gets, the fire going with everybody, and he, gets this crusade going. So, around the year 1202, the leaders of the crusade get together, and they figure out who's going to be coming. Most of them come from France. Once again, most of them come from France. And they're like, well, how are we going to get there this time? Well, going overland, remember, takes too long. It takes forever to walk there. If you're only marching 10, 15 miles a day, it takes months and months and months to get there. So let's go by ship. And that's, sounds great, because the ship is, by ship, it's only going to take a month or a little bit more to get there, and then you can start fighting. But the problem is that, A, there's not enough ships available, okay? Because it's not like there's a giant French Navy that could help. There's no such thing. There's no French or English Navy or anything like that. There's not enough ships available to take the amount of men that they're expecting. And number two, it's expensive, right? To stick, you can shove a ton of guys onto a ship, but what else do you need? You need their supplies, and more specifically for the knights, you need their horses. That costs a lot of money. So in the year 1202, they go to two different cities that they believe, can help them out. Okay, get back to the thingy here. There we go. There's the Pope. Okay. They go to two different places that they believe can help them. The first one is Genoa on this side. Genoa is one of the leading trading, so it's on this side of Italy, is one of the leading trading powers in Europe. It's a small city-state. It doesn't belong to a kingdom. It's its own little confined city-state, which we know what those are. They go there. Genoa says, no, we're not interested. We're fine. Because remember, the Genoese and anybody who's trading, they're Christian, obviously, they're Catholic, but they're worshiping the almighty dollar at this point. They're, you know what I mean, the gold. They don't want to take the chance of screwing that up, of messing up trading schedules and going and killing the very people they're trading with. Because who are they trading with? They're trading with Muslims. They're trading with the Jewish population. They're trading with anyone who's willing to trade them with them, okay, in the Holy Land. So they're not about to become crusaders. So the crusader leaders go to the next one, and that is Venice. And once again, Venice is its own city-state. It's not controlled by anybody else. It's right there. They're good Christians, but once again, they worship gold, okay? So they go to the Doge there, or D-O-G-E, or the Duke of Venice, and he's this old guy. He's blind. His name is Dandolo, D-A-N-D-O-L-O, and they say to Doge Dandolo, Supreme Doge, we need your help. Well, what do you need? Well, we need you to, get us over to the Holy Land with ships. And he says, well, I'd like to help, but we don't because Venice was all based on trade. Venice had a gigantic navy. That's what they had. They didn't have a standing army. Their power was in their ships and in the shipbuilding. And he said, we don't have that amount of ships you need, because how many people are you expecting? And they said, well, probably a little over 30,000, including over 4,000 to 5,000 knights and horses and everything else. The Doge says, well, I just don't have that capability. The logistics aren't there. And he said, well, how long will it take to make them? And he says, you give me a year. But he puts in a caveat. He says, okay, here's the deal. You give me 1 year and I will have the ships, I will have the navy built for you to take you to the Holy Land, okay? And the Pope, they tell the Pope about this, and he says, okay, we can do that. And the Doge says, in 1 year, you come back and we will have the navy ready. However, I want half of the money up front. I want you to show that you're good for it, okay? So they do. They give him over 35,000 silver pieces, okay? Which is a huge amount of money, but he's going to expect the other 35,000 in a year when they come. So all the leaders go back, they start rallying the troops, and it's going to take them a long time. Like I said, they can't just mobilize in a week. It's going to take a long time to get everybody ready, provisions ready, everything else. A year goes by, they show up at the precise time, and now they've got an army in tow. They've got 30-some thousand, and there you go. The Doge is true to his word. The Venetians have put most of their trade on standby, and they've built a new navy for this new crusade, okay? And there it is. They've got dozens and dozens of ships ready to go, okay? But there's one problem, and the problem is they don't have the rest of the money. They've already given out that 30,000. They could not come up with another 30,000 for it. And the Doge says, well, what do you want me to do? Because the Doge is caught between a rock and a hard place now, because he says, basically, I can't just let you go for free. You gave me the down payment, but I need the rest. This has cost us a ton of time. a ton of money because we've lost trade, because everything has gone to just building this new navy for you. And so he doesn't know what to do. And so he has to think about it. And he says, okay, this is what we're going to do. You're going to get on the ships, and you're not off the hook for the rest of the money, but you're going to pay it off in installments when you can get it. And the leader's kind of looking at each other like saying, what do you mean? How are we going to get the money? He goes, well, as we go along, when you get the money, that money goes back to me for the most part. Okay. Now, do you see where this is going a little bit? This crusade, because this is a crusade, is suddenly shifting from a religious thing, right? With this religious background, like we're going to free the Holy Land from, the infidel, from the Muslims again. But now all of a sudden it's turned into this business venture, okay? And the Doge is saying to them, I'm gonna take you to the Holy Land. We're gonna take you to the Holy Land. My sailors are gonna sail you guys there, but we gotta make a stop first. And they say, what? So here's the thing. They get loaded up in the year 1203. Okay. The Doge and the Venetians sailed them right down the coast, the Adriatic, to this little city here in modern day Croatia, and it's called Zara, Z-A-R-A. Okay, so this is all the Fourth Crusade. They say, what are we doing here? Well, he says, this used to belong to the Venetians. The Venetians have trading ports all over the coast, okay, especially here, okay? They got trading, and they've got trading ports all across the Eastern Mediterranean here. This used to be one of them, but it isn't anymore. Basically tells them, look, your first stop before we make it to the Holy Land is this place, Zara, on the coast. I want you, as now he has what he has never had, which is an army. He's got knights, everything else. He's got actual warriors. I'm going to land you there. Our Navy's going to land you there. I want you to take that city. I want you to take the city and let us have the city, give it to us, and give us all the stuff you take from it. And they say, okay, but there's just one problem. It's a Christian city. It's not a Muslim city. There's no Muslims there. It's a Christian city. So basically, he's using this Christian army to attack a Christian city for the sake of paying off their debt. So they land there. Word gets back to Innocent III, and he says, no, that's a Christian city. You can't attack it. It's so ridiculous that even one of the leaders of the crusade, he leaves. He takes his men and he takes off. He says, I'm not going to do this. I'm going over to fight the Muslims. I'm not going to fight other Christians. He leaves with his men, but there's still plenty of men there. So they take it there and they attack the city. They fight the inhabitants. At one point, the people in this city walls, they're even like putting banners of like the Virgin Mary and everything else there, basically, holding up their crucifixes and their crosses and everything else and saying, stop, we're a Christian. But the Crusaders are not in the mood to parley. And they take the city. They kill a bunch of people, including Christians, and they take the city and they give it over to the Venetians. When the Pope hears about this, he excommunicates the whole crusading army. He's beyond furious. He basically says, how could you do this? This is the most embarrassing thing on the planet. I can't believe you did this. He excommunicates them. So now you have a disgruntled army that's been booted out of the Catholic Church. You have disgruntled leaders, and you still have a disgruntled Venetian who is upset that his money isn't being paid, the debt. Well, it just so happens, and this is usually what happens in history, is that little things pop up. One of those little things is this guy shows up with his entourage, and you don't have to know his name because who cares? But who he is he is the son of the deposed emperor of the Byzantines, of the Eastern Romans. He is the son. Now his father was the emperor for like 3 years. Then he got kicked out he got thrown out. And there's a new guy there that's taken over the emperorship. Well, this guy's son shows up and he gives them an offer they can't refuse. He says, look, I know that you guys are in financial dire straits. I know that things are not working out for you, and you haven't even made it to the Holy Land yet. What I want you to do is, before you go to the Holy Land, take me with you, and let's do a little detour to Constantinople. When you get there, I want you to march in with me. There's no way they can stand against you because, this is a huge army. Go there and get me in and put me on the throne, and I will give you the rest of the money to give to the Venetians. They're kind of hemming and hawing about this one. They don't know about this one. They're like, well, the last thing, because remember, if they go to Constantinople and they have to fight, once again, they're fighting a Christian city. So they make it there. He says, don't you worry about it. There's not going to be any fighting. The people want me. They don't want this guy who's thrown my father out of office. They want me. So they stick him on the boat. They head off to Constantinople. When they make it there, that's exactly what happens. They show up. The new emperor's weak. The people boot him out. They stick in the new guy, and he's like, great, awesome. And they're like, perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. Now give us our money. Well, they run into another problem. And the problem is that even though Constantinople is one of the most urbane and rich cities on the planet, remember at this point, there's about 500,000 people in Constantinople. It is the fulcrum between East and West, right? Financially, the empire has been strained to the point where they don't have much money, right? They've been fighting the Turks over here and the other Muslim armies. They've lost more and more territory to the point where they're smashed down to this little area compared to how they used to be. And the city is rich, like because of all the trade, but the treasury is exhausted. They have no money. And so, well, now the Crusaders are getting a little upset about this. Like, we got you here. You're the new emperor, so give us what you promised. And so what the emperor starts doing is he starts going to the churches in Constantinople. He starts stripping down things out of the walls, off the walls. He starts giving these Crusaders gold, whatever he can find, basically to get them off his back. The people don't like this, so they kick him out of office too. They throw him out of office as well. And they basically bar the gates to the Crusaders, like, get lost, we don't want you here. Well, now you've got a big army and it's pissed off. They're not getting paid. They haven't made it. They've been on campaign now for like a year almost. They've been excommunicated. But Innocent III has kind of had a change of heart. He's basically saying to himself, this might be a way for us to finally unify the churches, that tempting offer that got the First Crusade started in the first place. This might be a chance for us to, get this going. And basically the Crusaders say, look, this guy promised us cash, you didn't give it to us, we want it. The people say no, they bar the gates, and they say go away, and the Crusaders don't go away. And what do the Crusaders do? They attack the city itself. They attack the city of Constantinople. Now, Constantinople has been attacked over and over again at this point for over 800, 900 years, and it is yet to fall. Nobody has ever taken Constantinople because the landward side is, there's 3 giant sets of walls. Nobody can get past it. It's impossible. It would take, an army bigger than any group that has been around at this point. It can't be taken. And so the people feel pretty safe behind their walls. But the Crusaders, and once again, the Doge of Venice, he's still there with his sailors. He says, I got a better idea. So remember, the Constantinople is surrounded on one side by, right, so here's the city. So you've got on one side, on the land, the walls, and all around here is the ocean, right, is the sea. There's walls here too, but they're not as tall as the landward side walls. But they've never had to deal with this type of attacking force before, so what do the Crusaders do? They all jump into the boats that brought them there, and they attack from the sea, basically pouring in from the weaker side, and they take the city. And they destroy the city. So once again, a Christian army destroys a Christian city. And this is a huge, huge disaster for Christianity. This is a catastrophe for the Byzantine Empire. Okay, this is the first time that this city has fallen since it was, made to where it was by Constantine. It is taken over, and the Fourth Crusade never makes it to the Holy Land. Not one of those guys steps foot in the Holy Land. They stay there. They ransack the place. They massacre a ton of people. They steal everything that they can. And so this entire Fourth Crusade turns into just a big, complete disaster, a complete joke. Now, why is this such a problem? Well, number one, you didn't make it to the Holy Land. So the whole point of the Crusade was not even, it was attempted, but not done. But number two, and most importantly, is that it took crusading Christians to do what the Islamic armies could not do in the past 600 years. They've been attacking the Byzantines for 600 years at this point, and they could never get into that city. It took Christians to defeat Christians to get there. And this spells the final schism between the East and West churches. Why the heck would, if you're an Eastern Christian, right, Greek Orthodox, why would you now join with the Romans, with the Roman Catholic Church, after what you just saw, what they did to your grand, beautiful city? But more importantly, this basically kicks open the door of Europe for the Muslim advance into Europe. Remember, they had been stopped for a long time, but now this grand city that had stood kind of as like a wall, a bulwark against further Islamic expansion, it's down, it's open, it's wide open. And the Muslims there, the Turks, will waste no time in exploiting that over the next 400 years. They will slowly push into southeastern Europe through Constantinople in there. Now, this is not the end of the Byzantine Empire. It will come back, but this is the end of them as any significant power in Europe. Okay, the once great Eastern Roman Empire is really on its knees at this point. Okay, all right, folks, let's move on quickly. We've got so many notes. Where are we? Okay, folks. One of the other things that the Pope does, Innocent III, remember, because he is a guy who is expanding the power of the church. One of the other things, the major thing that he does, is in the year 1215. I convert this stuff. Yeah. This is an important year. We're going to talk about yet something else. Whoops. That happens in the year 1215. In the year 1215, the Pope, Innocent, once again, he convenes what's called the Lateran Council. This is the fourth one, but it is basically, he sends the word out in 1214, and then 1215, they all show up. There's over 900 bishops and high-ranking church officials that show up to Rome. And this has not been done in a long time. They gather together and they discuss the future of the Catholic Church, and they discuss the power and everything else that's going on with the Roman Catholic Church. And with the Fourth Lateran Council, it's a way for the Pope to analyze and stress, who's in charge, who's on his side, who's not, but how are things going? Because remember, all of these church fathers are coming from all around Europe. So how are things going over here in eastern France, or how are things going up in north of England, or how are things going over in northern Spain? Tell us your problems, and we'll see. And that's what they do. It's a council that's intended to provide solutions to the problems of the church as they run into problems, of faith. So what are some problems you're seeing with people that are turning towards heretical thought? How can we stop that? But also, what are we going to do about money? So tithes and everything else. How much money is going to keep going up to the Pope? How much is going to stay in the communities? But then also they're talking about the investiture controversy. They're talking about any pressure that the kings and nobles are putting on them wherever they come from. We also see with the Fourth Lateran Council that they are discussing other complications of society, including the issue of the Jewish population. This was always interesting with the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. They tended to focus a lot on the Jewish populations throughout Europe, even though the Jewish populations are always very, very tiny, a minority of a minority in these places. You just did not have a large Jewish presence anywhere, except, like we talked about before, in Spain. But most of them were not under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church because they were in Muslim-held territory. They had a little bit more freedom there in comparison to where they, got their, rights and things taken away from them in places like France and England. But the stress was on, trying to bring, because the idea was that the Jewish communities were, the first transgressors against Christ. That they were the first people that had been wayward away from the teachings of Jesus Christ, and that they needed to be, brought to heel. They needed to be, forced to learn, hopefully, the errors of their ways, which was nonsense. No Jewish communities were going to sit there and teach their children, how, Christianity was great and how they should all convert to Christianity en masse. It just, it was kind of strange. And it's at the Fourth Lateran Council that you see ideas float around and actually get put into practice in some places where Jewish communities were going to be singled out, like literally singled out. So, and this was going to go back, and these people are going to go back and tell the king's authority, we should start doing this with the Jewish populations, including actually showing them physically. And what that meant was that Jewish people were going to have to start wearing certain adornments on themselves to signify they were Jewish. In the medieval times, they were not wearing like the Star of David or anything like that, unfortunately, that you see much later on when we get to modern Europe and we see the horrors of the Holocaust with the Star of David. But they're going to be wearing a circle, a yellow circle, which is going to signify that this is a Jewish person. And it's a way for Christians to kind of keep their distance away from them, as if like some, being around a Jewish person, you're going to suddenly contract some contagion or something like that. But once again, we see this this bigotry and this persecution against the Jewish communities of all people underneath this Fourth Lateran Council. So that's that. Okay, but moving on really quickly. And to finish out our talks today, we talked about the rise of these two laws, right? These two laws, the king between the kings and his law, and the Pope and his law. But now we also see the rise of, so there's Innocent III, right? We also see the rise of the king himself, okay, throughout these kingdoms. For the longest time, the king was, we've mentioned this several times, the king was kind of a figurehead in his own kingdom. The nobles were the ones that controlled everything. But over time, leading up to the end point of these high Middle Ages, by the time you get to the year 1300, and this is a map showing Europe around the year 1200. Okay, as you can see, the Muslims, the Muslim domains are slowly getting pushed out by these Christian kingdoms. But by the year 1200, between the year 1200 and 300, we're starting to see the solidification of the king as the king. He is in charge. No longer can like some warlord or noble, like away from down another part of the kingdom, do his own thing. Once you swear fealty to the king, you are now beholden to the king. You follow his laws. You follow what he says. When he needs you, you go fight with him. You're paying taxes. You're doing everything that you need to do, being a good sworn person to him, right? You paid him homage and fealty, and you're expected to uphold your end of the bargain, just like he's expected to uphold his part of the bargain. That only through him can you also truly succeed. Okay. So this is a consolidation of centralized, it's centralizing authority. In effect, it is showing that the king is now in charge, especially in England, especially in France, especially in these small kingdoms that are coming up in Spain, or that the emperor is in charge in the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. But you're running into, once again, another problem, and this problem is the idea of, get rid of this. So we have the rise of the king. So in the 1200s, the rise of the king. Okay? Okay. Okay. This whole problem, there we go. This whole problem stems from that whole, two laws thing. But now it's starting to branch out, this problem, okay? And the idea is that the more power the king gets, the more power the king pushes. Basically, who we ask, if you're there, if you're noble in the year 1200, you're asking yourself, and you have to come to grips with this when it comes to the people underneath you, how much power should the king have? The king is now in charge. The king has been in charge for a couple generations at this point. And I'm a high profile person as well too, but I still owe my allegiance to the king. And so the idea that you're telling your people and that you are dealing with is that when it comes to the power of the king, how much difference is there between civic participation and individual freedoms? Okay, now this is the Middle Ages. So individual freedoms, well, nobody's running around standing on their soapbox talking about individual freedoms, okay? You don't have the right to assemble. You don't have the right to, worship how you want. You don't have the right to challenge the authority of the king. So individual freedoms is a very nebulous, very vague term here, okay? But where it does become clear, and this is focusing specifically in the Kingdom of England, okay? So, not that, I'll get there, okay. All right, and this all comes from the idea of, because this always comes back to this, is the idea of taxation, okay? Taxation, we all know what taxation means, right? Collecting taxes. Now, the idea between this, civic participation and individual freedoms, is an old one, okay? The Greeks and Romans were trying to figure this out too, okay? Long before the Middle Ages happened. The idea is that if you were a person in a community, how much of you is dedicated to civic participation? So like being a part of the community, If I'm a part of the community, I'm a part of the community. If I don't want to be a part of the community, then I guess I can go live as a hermit somewhere in some cave somewhere, and I don't have to deal with it. But if I'm living in a village, even if it's a small village, I'm still part of the civic community. And this small village is still part of this larger estate, right, held by this noble. And this larger estate is still held by this county or duchy by a high noble. And this is part of a kingdom held by the king. So I'm a part of it, whether I like it or not. I'm there. And most people didn't get a choice. You weren't born I don't want to be a part of this. I'm going to run off somewhere. Unless you became, cloistered and you were part of a religious movement or dedicated to the church. But for the most part, most people were stuck with this idea. Now, if you were a peasant, there was no real debate. Okay, you just did what you did because that's what your father did, that's what your grandfather did, that's what your great grandfather did, and so on. That's what your wife did, that's what her father did, and so on. Okay, all the way back. But we're talking about the people that are a little bit above that. okay? Because then the other part of this coin, the other side of this coin, is individual freedoms. So once again, if you're a peasant, you have no individual freedoms. You do as you're told. But if you're a person in power, if you're a nobleman, like an earl in England, or a baron, right below an earl, you are in charge of all these people, and you have to come to grips with how much do I owe the king, and how much do I follow the king, and how much of this is focusing on this civic community type of thing, and how much of this is focusing on my own needs and my own wants. And it always comes back to, once again, this idea of taxation. As people go along, and this is, people grumble and piss and moan about this all the time, even now, today is tax day, April 15th, 2020. Most people come to grips realizing that in a community, taxation is necessary, okay? That no anything, no political entity, no government, no nothing can stand without bringing in money. Gotta have money, okay? Because if you rely completely on charity, well, you'll always fall short. It just won't happen, okay? People tend to focus on their own needs. But that brings up the question, what is more powerful? The wants of the few compared to the needs of the what? The many, right? It's really amazing that we're talking about this now, and we're even dealing with that same question now under a different theme, right? Like the whole idea of like the quarantine, okay? Which group supersedes the other one? Which group is better? The wants of the few versus the needs of the many, or the wants of the many versus the needs of the few. In relation to, if the powers that be tell us all we have to stay home, well, how long do you stay home for? And how long do you say, okay, I'm willing to do this? These people were thinking the same thing. If you're a baron, right, or a lesser noble than the king, taxation. How much money can the king demand from me? Does he get to just demand? Here, I got some questions for you, okay? Where are my questions? Oh, wait, go. Here we go. How often is the king allowed to tax us? So can the king just come by and say, I want a tax from you? What can he tax? Okay. If he taxes us and he runs out of money, can he tax us again? Is there like a special amount of time that he has to wait, or can he just tax us whenever he needs the money? Okay. What about special considerations? Let's say that the king declares war, and wars cost money. Is he allowed to tax us again, even though he's already taxed us? What happens if the war is declared against us? Does he get to raise more taxes as opposed to when he starts? Okay. If there's a natural disaster, which it happens, if there's an earthquake or a flood, is he allowed to tax us more to help with these problems? Okay. And then how is he able to enforce it? Is the king just able to come and just take from us if we don't give it to him? Is he allowed to not take from us? Is he allowed to take any form of taxes, not just gold, but is he allowed to take my home from me, whatever it might be? Now, under feudalism, a lot of that was already settled. Remember, none of those things that the peasants lived in, like their homes or their fields, belonged to them. It was belonged to the nobles anyway. But now we're talking about the noble's relationship to the king. Is he allowed to just take from us what he wants? Now, in France, this was already set in stone, that the king had almost absolute authority, that the king, over time, over the hundreds of years, the king had gotten to the point where he just could do whatever he wanted, okay? Sure, he asked the nobles their opinions, but for the most part, he got to do whatever he wanted. But in England, this was a lot different. Yes, William the Conqueror rolled in there and he took over and he did his thing. But the one thing that William the Conqueror could not do completely was to wipe out the ancient customs of the people that were there after the Romans. And that were the Angles and Saxons, right? And so as the Angles and Saxons slowly mix with these Normans, and they form this idea of what it means to be English, those old ideas still come around. And those old ideas are some of the freest, most open ideas in Europe. In most of Europe, like in the Spanish kingdoms, in France, and in Germany, you do as the king says. We're at this point now between the year 12 and 1300 and moving on from there, that you do as the king commands, that you have advisors and counselors, but it's what the king says goes. But in England, it's different, and it still remains different between the years 1200 and 1300 and so on. And it's going to remain that way all the way up to the present day. That the English have a tradition that the king sends out, or whoever's in charge, sends out his rules, his laws. He says, this is what he does. And he does it through a person called the reeve, okay? The reeve. The reeve is basically like it's a government position. He's an overseer. He goes out to all of these different places around England, and he tells the king's commands to the people. Okay. Now, he's not just talking to the regular peasantry. He's talking to the people that own land, right? The nobles. He's talking to these people and saying, look, this is what the king commands. These places in England, just like on the continent, in France, we have counties. These places in England are often called, there's counties there, but then they also keep the old term for it called a shire. Okay. So multiple shires. Okay. These two words start to meld together, because this person is, he's the person that's in charge of showing the king's laws around the countryside, but he's also there to enforce it as well too. Like, you need to do this or else. And these two words start to meld together to the point where we still have this even in this country. I don't know if you can figure it out, but if we say shire reeve, sheriff, sheriff. So that's where the term sheriff comes from. So the sheriff is the head law enforcement person in a county with the county police, and it comes from these two words together. But in England, like I said, it's a little bit different. So the reeve will show up. He will say what the king demands, and then the people will come together. The people, as in the barons, the nobles, will come together as this in this council, and they will debate it. They will say, hey, is the king allowed to do that? So this, remember, once again, like in France, is unheard of, but in England, it's a little bit different. This ancient custom over the years has become what is known as English common law. Okay, English common law. And English common law, so basically, it's the law that does not derive from the king. It's a common law that has derived over time, over a period of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's not for the king, it's for the people to stand up to the king. Okay, now at this time period, it's not the people as in the people. Okay, this is not do not get confused. It's not some grassroots, power of the people movement. Okay, the people are not sitting there, marching and protesting in London or something like that. They are, this is a battle between the nobles and the king. Okay, so who are we looking at here? This is the stencil drawing of the top of the, what's it called? I am zoning out. The sepulcher, right? The tomb of an English king. And I don't know if you remember, so I'll go back really quickly. All right, so remember, when Henry II married Eleanor, she started having babies and babies and babies. But after a while, they either die or they're married off. And Henry II's gone. Eleanor's still alive. And the only person she's got left, because Richard gets killed in battle, and Geoffrey gets killed as well. So the last person available is the baby. So remember, she loved Richard. He was her favorite, but Richard dies in battle. Henry II loved his little baby boy the most, and John eventually becomes king in his 20s. Okay, he becomes king in his 20s. And well, here's the top of his tomb. No, there he is. When he inherits the throne of England, well, he's not only inherited the throne of England, he's also inherited all of those lands that were brought to him by his mother and by his father. But the thing is that John, King John, well, I'll give you a hint. You know how many King Johns there, like there's been like, King Richards, and there's been multiple King Georges and King Edwards. But you know how many Johns have been in English history, monarchical history? There's only been one. There's been King John the First. There's never been a King John the Second or King John the Third or King John the 87th or something like that. And there's a reason for that, because he was such a bad king. King John, when he took over, he's in his late 20s. He did not care about military like his father. He did not care about politics like his mother. He did not care about, the troubadour tradition and writing poetry. He did not care about any of that stuff. He didn't even care about keeping his lands. In France, for the most part, the one thing he cared about was girls. That's what he liked. He liked girls. There was not a girl at court that he was not chasing after. He was married, didn't matter. Chased after her ladies in waiting. He chased after her servant girls, didn't matter. That's all he cared about. And Eleanor at this point is like, pushing 70, and she's like trying to keep him under, control, trying to keep the lands in France. And she's like, you have to do something. So he starts fighting in France, and he even goes there a couple times. But like I said, the apple fell very far from the tree. He did not inherit the militaristic capabilities of his father or his older brothers, and he's a terrible general. And so he ends up getting, beaten over and over again in France. He doesn't go on crusade, anything like that. He gets beaten in France. So if we take a look at this, in 1180, in red, this is everything that the English own in France. As you can see, they own nearly half of the Kingdom of France. By the year 1223, okay, so about 40 years later, that's all they have left. Just a little part of Eleanor's former duchy. All the rest has been captured, even the old lands of Normandy here. Even those old ancient lands that William the Conqueror came from. It's all been gobbled up by the French crown. And it's really in part because of King John. He is just such a poor leader. He just does not know how to lead. He does not know how to be, not just a military person, but he just does not know how to be a good king. Because he was never expected to be king. He was the baby. You remember, his mother was like 44 when she had him. All these other brothers were supposed to be king, and they were to some degree, and then they died or they were killed, and so he's the king, and he's just not a good king. So he's fighting war after war in France. He's losing land after land in France. And remember, wars cost what? Wars cost money. So he needs money. Now, behind his back, his political opponents and even his friends are starting to call him John Lackland, or he's lacking land. They never call it to his face, obviously, because he'll have him executed, because he's the king still. But behind his back, he's considered a joke. All throughout Europe, he's considered a joke. He's good at one thing, and that's chasing girls. He's terrible at keeping the possessions of his parents and his grandparents and his great-grandparents and everything else going all the way back. And wars cost money. So what does he do? He doesn't impose a direct tax on the people, because that's not how it works. He imposes taxes on his nobles. Okay? And his nobles, the highest ranking nobles, there's dukes and everything else, but for the most part, the nobles that he has to deal with, because these are the ones closest tied to the people. Okay, these are the lowest levels of nobility in England. He goes to them, and he's basically telling them, all right, look, the last war didn't go well. I need some more money because I need to raise a new army. So the barons grumble, and because there's no law, right? There's no There's no law in the books that says, he can or can't do this. There's English common law, which is where this is heading to, okay? So they raise more money for him, and which means that the people were struggling because they just pay taxes, but now all of a sudden the barons come by and say, give us more taxes, and what are you going to do? You can't go fight in court or something like that. You have no rights. The barons grumble, but they pay some more taxes. He raises yet another army, sends it off to France. Imagine that. I'll give you 3 guesses what happens to that army. Gets wiped out. So what does he do? Goes back and he tells the barons again, I need more money. And this time they're hemming and hawing, and they're like, well, we just gave you taxes over and over again. We need to think about this. And he says, basically telling them, there's nothing to think about. By the divine right, by God's right, the temporal sword, I am the king of England. I am the king. It doesn't get higher than me, except if you think about the Pope. But the Pope's not here right now. I'm here right now, and I need you to give me money. And this isn't a request. I demand it. And so they give him some more money. And he raises an army, and he goes and he loses it again. And so he comes back and he does the same thing. But this time he's pushed too far. And the barons and at this point the barons are almost afraid for their own lives, because the people are suffering badly. The people they don't have any more money. They've given it all to barons. And then not only that, remember, the barons are not thinking really for the people. They're thinking for their own skins. They're trying to save their own skin, because who's sending him military men and everything else? These barons, right? Well, they're losing everybody to these wars in France that aren't being won. It'd be one thing if they're winning, because then he could give them titles and lands in France, but he's losing it all. So this time they tell him no, and this is a major confrontation. He's saying, what do you mean no? You can't tell me no, I'm the king. And they say, we are telling you no. We're putting our foots down. You cannot have any more money unless we do something else. And if you don't agree to this, well, then it's going to mean what? Civil war. It's going to mean that, and he says, you would do this to your king? You've sworn me your oaths, your fealty. And they say, yes, we will. We're all united front here. We will fight against you to prevent you from doing this thing. Because in England, remember, we have this idea of English common law, that the idea that the king cannot just rule like he's God on earth. He has to get not permission from the people or from his nobles, but he has to incorporate them. He has to bring them into the fold, into the decision making to a certain degree, unlike what the King of France does, who just rules completely. And King John is, no, you can't do this. And they say, we can. And so in the year 1215, so remember that fateful year, they sit his butt down by a little meadow in this by this little running stream called Runnymede. And you just picture this beautiful, quaint English countryside, and they sit him down there. Now the thing is that he doesn't have a position to bargain with from. It's not like he has his own army that can smash them down into submitting to him. Remember, he has to raise an army and funds from them, but they do have a certain amount of an army, and they do have what's left of the money, and so they sit him down, and they've written up this big, massive, not a letter, but a legal document. Okay, a legal document, and it's called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, and basically, inside all of this Latin is all of these little addendums, all these little critiques of his rule, but not just his rule specifically, but the rule of the king in England. And in this Magna Carta, they list out this new understanding that has been around for a long time in England, but now it's actually on paper. This new understanding of the law, that the law now says, and has always said to a certain degree, but now to a large degree in England, that the king is beholden to his nobles, not to the people, but to his nobles. This will change, and that the king is now beholden to his people, because that's how it is now in England. The queen is, well, she's the head of everything, but she's really the head of nothing. She's just a figurehead. Who is in charge of the people in England? The Prime Minister. He is the elected representative from the people, not from the nobles. The nobles are there's still a class in England, but they have most of their power has been nipped in the bud, is taken away. At this time, though, in 1215, so we're talking about 800 years ago, the people really have no say in it. It's the nobles. It's that middle ground that telling the king for the first time, we're putting this in words into law, that you do not have the authority to arbitrarily tax us. You do not have the authority to take from us what you want and when you want it. That we have a consideration in this bargain as well too, and that you only rule through what? Our good graces. Sure, you rule by the divine, authority of the Pope, but we're here, and you have to listen to what we want as well too. So basically, telling him, you can tax us, but there's rules on this. You can't just tax us willy-nilly. You can't just tax us whenever you want, because it always comes back to money, right, folks? That's how the way the world works. You can't just do what you want just because you're the king. You have immeasurable power, but we're going to rein in your power a little bit, because without us, you can't do anything. And basically they say, if you try and do something like bring in foreign influence here, we will depose you. You will be brought down utterly. And so for the first time in European history, you have a group of people that are in effect telling their king, there are rules and there are limits to your authority. There are rules and limits to your authority. And this is unheard of in the rest of Europe. And this is going to be unheard of in the rest of Europe for next 400 years to get to like the French Revolution. But this happens in medieval England. So this predates all that stuff by over 500 years. This is incredible. This is a huge turning point in the history of Western civilization, where you have a group of people telling the authority, the leader, no. Can you imagine this like in the Roman times, like them telling the emperor, no, you can't do this? No, the only group that was able to kind of do that was the Senate, but we saw by the second half of the empire that the Senate was just merely, figureheads, that they were just, there was nothing there. There's no power behind any of their actions or the words. But this one's different. The barons do have power. They have military power and they have financial power, and the king has neither on his own. He is beholden to them. And so they force him there they've all signed it. And what do they force him to do? They force him to sign it. And he begrudgingly does, because he knows he has nothing else to bet with or bluff with. And so he signs it. The very next year in 1216, he contacts the Pope. The Pope does not like this idea, because now all of a sudden you're introducing a new concept, that all of a sudden not only does the Pope and the King have power, but now the people have power. And the Pope doesn't like this, because he doesn't want to share power. He wants to keep the status quo. Hey, I'm in charge of the kings, and the kings are in charge of you, but I'm at the top. So the Pope basically negates the whole idea of the Magna Carta, and he says, no, it's okay, you won't be punished if you renege on this promise. And he basically absolves John of this. And so John tells the barons, well, forget it. I've had enough, and I'm not going to do anything that I promised that I said I would do. So what do the barons do? Well, they say, okay, well, let's get ready for war. But in that same year, 1216, John finally, he dies anyway, so it doesn't get to that. However, when his son becomes king, his son is a little boy at this point, and he is under the authority of his mother. She's the queen mother, who controls the population, who controls the kingdom. The barons are the ones who are in charge, and they are the ones who, at that point anyway, there will be a resurgence of kingship in England, but at that point the barons are in charge. Okay, so moving along really quickly, but it's hard to emphasize enough just how, hold on, let me turn off my timer. It is hard to emphasize enough just how important, like I said, that this is a really watershed moment in Western civilization. Like I said, the original Magna Carta doesn't exist. About 20, 30 years later, copies were made of it. And those are the ones that are still floating around the world. I think there's like 16 that are in existence. There's one in like the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. But this is the beginning, folks. This is the beginning of this common law, of this idea that there are limitations to the power of the highest authority of the king. And so when the English write their actual constitution, the English Constitution, 400 years later, the Americans are going to look at this, and they're going to be debating this and they're still using the idea of English common law to base their own new country when they create the United States of America in the late 1700s. But this is where it starts. This is a huge, huge transcending moment from the old age into this newer modern age, even though this took place 800 years ago, okay? One of the big things that comes up from this is the rise of a new institution. Rise of a new institution in England called the Parliament, or Parlement. It comes from, remember, so there's a lot of Frenchness going on in England at the time, and has been for over 200 years. Parley means, like it does in French, to talk, okay, to discuss, negotiate, and then ment is from the form of a council. And this is what the England still has. This is what the UK still has now, is the idea that you're going to send people together to talk, to represent you, to represent your problems. Now remember, in 1215, nobody gave two you-know-whats about the problems of the people. The vast majority of the people in England were not benefited by the Magna Carta then, okay? If you're a peasant, you're still a peasant, you're still gonna live your horrible life. You're still gonna do what's expected of you and what you're ordered to do. But we see here the beginnings of this idea of parliamentary process that, many hundreds of years later, eventually that power will start to trickle down to the people themselves. And you can't just, you don't just have nobles and kings that are leading, you have the people that are sending representatives. But that old custom comes from hundreds of years before. So in essence, this idea of parliamentary procedure and discussion can be tied to 1300 years ago, to the 700s, 800s, so even 400, 500 years before this time, the Magna Carta. But it all starts there. It's really amazing. It all starts there. Now, once again, in France, so here's a old representation of Parliament. See, you have the king still sitting over Parliament watching. And over time, over the hundreds and hundreds of years since that happens, the king's power will eventually diminish and will be sapped and will go away, and the people's power will rise. Okay, the people's power will rise. But in the year 1215, this is just a battle between the nobles and the king, not the people and the king, okay? And they have to justify to themselves and figure out, well, what are we going to do when it comes to, the debate between civic, right, responsibility and personal freedoms. Can the two coexist? And which side takes precedence over the other during certain occasions? Okay? All right, and moving on. Who's this pretty fellow? This guy is John's counterpart in France. Unlike John, who has to deal with a bunch of unruly nobles, the king of France, by the time you get to the 1200s, he is starting, like I said, to rule completely. He has a council of his nobles, his highest ranking nobles, and this is basically a nothing council. During this time, this will come to more prominence during the French Revolution, but that's not for a long time. So you have this guy. And underneath him are all of his leading, looks like list states, sorry. There we go. So at the top you have the king. This guy's name is, this is not an actual representation of him. This is an old painting that was done many years later. This is King Philip the Fair. Now, why he was called the Fair? Two reasons. But most prominently, one reason was that, well, he was pretty. He was a handsome guy to look at. As in fair as an equal, or not so much. And I'll tell you a story about that here in a second. But underneath him, he had the Estates General. So his highest, his highest council members, the people, the highest nobles in the land would come. They would talk to him, give him recommendations. But overall, there was absolutely zero representation when it came to anybody underneath the king. The king ruled from Paris at this point, and the king did what the king wanted to do. If the king wanted to raise taxes, the king raised taxes. If the king wanted more tax, he got more tax. If the king wanted to start 18 wars, he could start 18 wars. There was no real check to his power. There was no real limitations to his power, and this will keep going on for hundreds and hundreds of years in France, okay? You have the Estates General, which is just kind of a figurehead body. There's not really any power behind it, because remember, in these preceding years between the Dark Ages, right, the early Middle Ages up to the high point of the Middle Ages, you see a shifting from the power of the nobles, right, goes down, and the power of the king goes up, okay? So totally unlike what you have in England. Now, why are we talking about this gentleman? We're talking about him because of these groups of people, this group of people. Remember, the Crusades are still going on to some degree. They're going to go on for a long time. And there's still going to be a European presence in the former Crusader states, even as they get picked off and get recaptured. But there's still going to be a Crusader presence there over the next couple hundred years. And so we have, in the 1200s, the rise of the Okay. We have the rise and the sanctioning creation by the of a group of knights in the 1200s that, in the 1100s. They are a group of knights, and they are knights from all around Europe, but primarily in France. The majority of them come from France, and they are in the Holy Land. And they take their name from the temple. So the picture I showed you many talks ago of the old temple, the old Jewish temple. And that's kind of their base in Jerusalem. And the First Crusade was a great thing for them. They are religious. They are religious knights, right? All, to a certain degree, knights are all religious. But these ones take the religiosity to a further degree. They wear white, okay, tunics, and then they wear the red cross, okay, on their shields, on their horses, on their tunics, everywhere they can, to signify them as this is part of a group. They are officially sanctioned by the Pope in the 1100s, and so you have to do certain things. You can't just call yourself a Templar. You have to do certain things to get accepted into the order of the Templars. You have to, show that you are a knight, obviously. You have to show that you are, that you're doing everything that the Templars expect you to do. And they bounce back and forth between Europe and between the Holy Land. They take on like vows of chastity, just like the priests do. They're not allowed to go off and have sex with anybody. They're like priests in armor on horses. Okay, they are priestly knights. This is their seal. Okay, but they are a military order. So remember, they're there to kill the enemies of Christ. They are not just there to spread the word of God. They're there to kill the enemies of Christ. But they are also there to administer to the poor. They're there to take care of the Christians that are still there in the Crusader states, and so on. And this is their sigil. Okay, so like their stamp. You know that these are Templars because there's two knights riding on one horse. So basically, they're showing that they're not in it for the money or the glory. They're in it to show their dedication to Christ and to Christ's teachings. So two knights on one horse. Okay. Well, you're not fighting all the time. Okay, I mean, you're fighting a lot of the times, but you're not fighting all the time. So what do the Templars start doing? They start, they start making money. And they're making money from this newfound expansion of East and West cultures and ideas, right? And trade and everything else. And they're not traders. They're not, you don't see a bunch of knights on, trading ships, moving merchandise, something like that. But they figure out a different way of making money, because it takes money to keep up their horses and their forts and everything else in the Holy Land. But they figure out a different way of making money, and it's very interesting how they do it. They are considered to be one of the first instances of banking to a certain degree in Europe. Now, we're going to talk about banking in the next talk and the one after that, because it's very important. So I don't want you to think that and get them, misunderstand me and think that, the Templars are setting up banks as we know them. We think of a bank and you go in there and it's where people put their money, and it's where, people, not only, banks don't make money by just having you put your money in the bank. They make money through investments, right? Well, we know that, remember, we talked about one of the problems of the Catholic Church and one of the prohibitions against Christians for doing this was the idea of usury, right? Of loaning out money with the intention of making money off of it, charging a high interest rate. So the Templars, they invest their money, from their conquests and everything else in a lot of different enterprises. But one of the things they come up with, and this is really interesting, is that they institute this idea of a note, okay, just a regular old note. Now, this has been made obsolete in the modern age with cards and all that stuff. But I still remember the days of when you went to another country, most people carried cash. Well, you didn't want to carry cash running around with, big billfold of cash in some foreign country. You don't want to do it here, let alone in some foreign country where you don't know the customs, everything else. So what people would do is they would go to a bank and they would tell the bank, I'm leaving to wherever, Switzerland, and I'm going to be there for 6 months and I need a bunch of money. You would give them X amount of dollars and the bank would take that money and then they would give you a booklet of what was called a traveler's check. And a traveler's check was, you took it over, this traveler's check, they kept the money, you took the traveler's checks over to this country. When you needed something, you would sign it like it was a regular check, you'd hand it to the person that you're buying whatever your stuff from, and then they would, see how much it was for, and then they would take the funds out of the bank's account, the bank representatives, whatever connection they had with that bank in that foreign country. And then they would give you the change. So you'd have a little bit of spending cash, because they wouldn't cut you a check. You'd have a little bit of cash back, and then you still have these other, checks. Now, like I said, that's been made obsolete with just regular cards now. But back in the day, that was how people did it. The Templars, in a very rudimentary way, came up with the same concept. So if you were a merchant and you were in Venice and you were going to the Holy Land, well, you didn't want to carry around a big bag of gold. Same problem. Pirates attack, they're going to take your gold. If you're going down the road, brigands, attack, ruffians, whatever you want to call them, thieves, and they steal your stuff. They know what's there. You've got gold hanging off of your off your belt. So they came up with the same idea. And the Templars, what they did was they put branches of their Templar houses all around Europe, especially in France. They were centered in France. So once again, you could go to a Templar banking house. It wasn't called a bank, and it didn't serve the purposes of a bank that we know of. We're going to talk about that later. But you could go to this place, you can give them their money, and what they would do was they would sign a note for you. They would sign it saying, whoever you were, John Smith, gave us X amount of pieces of gold, and then they would stamp it with their sigil, right? They would make it official, they'd sign it, the Grand Master or whatever would sign it. and then you'd put it in your pocket and you'd go. And let's say you were going to Jerusalem and you'd make it there, and you'd go to one of their houses, once again, one of their banking houses, there, wherever you were. You'd hand them that note, they'd look at it, analyze it, make sure it was legit, and then they would give you your gold, right? Not your specific gold that you turned in, but they would give you gold from, from their coffers, from their treasury to give to you because it was your gold. And how did they make money off that? They made money off of charging you a fee. Here, we'll do this for you. You have to give us X amount of pieces of this gold, and then we'll do it for you. Well, it worked. And it made this group of people, this religious order of knights, very, very wealthy. They were all over the place. Well, money does crazy things to people, folks. Does crazy, crazy things to people. And so, Philip the Fair, right? Old Philip, he's fighting his wars against England. He's trying to take back what, is his kingdom, and it costs money. And, sometimes he runs out of money. So he gets a brilliant idea. He says, who are the two groups of people in my kingdom that have the most money? Number one are the Jewish communities. But he's already gone to that well, and that well's dry. He's already taxed and just taken away a ton of the gold from these Jewish communities, because there's not like they can stop him. He's the king. And basically he says, if you don't give me your money, I'll banish you out of the kingdom, or I'll kill you, or do all this horrible stuff to you. So they have to give him, well, he's tapped out that resource, nothing left. So he's like, there's another group, especially in my kingdom, that has a ton of money, and that's the Templars. What is he going to do? He can't just say, go give me your money. They're, number one, they're a religious order, so they don't answer to him. Okay, they answer to who? They answer to the Pope. They are his warriors. They're his soldiers. They're the soldiers of Christ. And plus, they're a dominant force. He doesn't have enough knights to just go and fight them and take their gold. And then plus, he'd get excommunicated, right? Like, oh, I'm going to go kill these Christian soldiers to take their gold. I mean, that's a terrible excuse. So what does he do? He can't just do that, but he needs that gold. So what does he do? He goes to the Pope, and he tells him his plan. I can't remember the Pope's name, doesn't matter, but he tells him his plan. Basically says, look, I need this gold. I need this, I need their power, their influence, and I need them out of here because they're becoming too powerful in my kingdom. People are starting to focus on them and less on me. And so you'd expect the Pope to say like, no, absolutely not. You cannot do this. They're my guys. But the Pope instead says, well, tell me more. And the French king, Philip, says, well, when I do this and I take this gold, I will give you half. I will give you the half that I don't take. And the Pope at the time, because they're already giving the Pope a ton of money because, he gets his cut, but now he wants all the rest of it. And he says, okay. And so what happens is, it's really amazing that they were able to carry this out, especially in a time period in the mid 1200s, the first quarter century of the 1200s, that they're able to do this, without modern conveniences like telephones or anything else. Somehow Philip and his men, they planned this kind of hit and run tactic with the Templar houses, with these banking houses. They on the preordained date, they raided all of these places, literally when these guys were just like, chilling out, and there's thousands of them all around the country. And he doesn't have jurisdiction in another country, so they're there. But the main group of them was in France, and they ransack these houses, they take their money, and the reasoning that they give is that they put all these trumped up charges of what? Good old heresy against them. They basically, these fake charges against them that they're committing, homosexual acts with one another, because since they can't, like visit a brothel or something like that, they're basically, having sex with each other, which is, absolute sin, unforgivable, according to the church at the time. So that's punishment enough, because they're considered sodomites. that they're, they make up all these lies about them, that they're doing like satanic worship, that they're worshiping Christ in their own way. They've spent too long in the Holy Land. They've learned all of these evil heretical, all this evil heretical thought from, the very enemies they're supposed to be defeating, the Muslims. They tie them in with Jewish customs, everything else. So they basically, folks, this is just a purge, right? P-U-R-G-E. They purge them. The whole point is to take what they want and to destroy the organization, okay? Now, just like the sacking of Constantinople earlier, right? This does not help Christianity. This is not a boost to Christianity. By destroying Constantinople, like I said, you've kicked open the door for the actual enemies of Christendom at the time, which is the Muslims. But by doing this, in one fell swoop, they have destroyed a huge, trained, veteran fighting force of Christian knights. And that's what they do. They gather them up, the highest, the lowest ranking members, the lowest knights, they tell them, recant, right? So admit all this awful stuff that you've done, and they do it under torture, right? So like, if you get your hand smashed enough times, you're gonna admit to anything. And so they forced them to sign, affidavits saying, oh yes, I did this, and then I saw these higher level guys doing this. It was terrible. It was disgusting what they did, and so on. And so they would give them like a penance, like they removed their knighthoods, but at least they got to live. But with the higher ups, you couldn't do that. So basically, they went to the higher ups, and so the very top of this order, the leader of this group is called the Grand Master. Okay, the Grand Master, and then he has all these other people underneath him as well. And the Grand Master at the time was a knight, the head knight. He's a veteran soldier. His name was Jacques de Molay, and he's consigned to the flames with his his lieutenants, and he knows what's happening. He's not some dummy. He knows what's happening, and he basically gives a curse to the Pope and to Philip the Fair, telling them, God sees what you're doing here, and you will be punished eventually. I don't know. The Pope, I can't remember the Pope's name, doesn't matter. But the Pope died like the next year, so maybe the curse worked. Philip the Fair lived lived longer, so I guess the curse did not hit him as well. But that's the end of the Templar Order as a veteran military unit. But once again, this does not serve a purpose that helps the Christian church. You've gotten rid of this huge fighting force that could have been used and was being used against the Muslims during the Crusades, and to help pilgrims that were going back and forth. And now you've gotten rid of them, and it was all for the sake of money, for greed, because you needed money, and well, now you got your money, and you've gotten rid of this huge force. And so this really spells the ending, like the purging of the Knights Templar. Really spells the ending of the old Crusades. Like I said, there's still going to be Crusades afterwards, but it really spells the end of the old crusading factions as we've seen them. Okay, so that, and talk about that some other time. Okay, folks. So that is it for this week. Remember, if you have any questions, please email me. And once again, next week we have our third and last quiz, so do not forget. Same thing, I already explained that in the first part. Questions, please send them to me. But I've heard a bunch of good ideas from people about their papers and about their projects, so I'm really jazzed to read them and really jazzed to see them, what you guys come up with. I've seen some really good subjects, as in people that you guys are like, hey, should we do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Yes, okay. Remember to pay attention to your requirements on the paper. If you have any questions, please contact me about that too. Don't wait till the last minute. And there we go. So, folks, stay safe. Enjoy the sunshine. It's beautiful outside. So I don't know, we can't go to a ball game, but go take a walk or something, okay? And I'll see you next week.